When a game is described as linear, it's taken as a given in RPG discourse that this is a design flaw. Meanwhile, open world has become such an unquestioned good that it barely even needs defending. Linear is bad, open world is good. But I think that framing is deeply wrong. Not just because linear games can be great, but because some of the most critically acclaimed RPGs ever made succeeded in large part because they were linear. And in this video, I want to explain why. First, a quick disclaimer. While I'm challenging the orthodoxy that open world design is strictly superior to linear design, I'm not arguing that open world games are bad or that they don't deserve their popularity. Many open world games are fantastic, and their success speaks for itself. What I am arguing is that open world design comes with crucial and often under-discussed trade-offs. Because if linear bad, open world good is common wisdom in RPG discussion, an arguably stronger truth enshrined in the hearts of gamers is the importance of pacing. And that's the tension I want to unpack here. If strong pacing is a virtue of game design, doesn't that fundamentally sit at odds with large sandboxes and unrestricted player freedom? If a game director wants to direct the flow of narrative beats and emotional moments, wouldn't a more linear structure empower them to do exactly that and tighten the experience accordingly? But before we get into case studies, I want to discuss player psychology, because this is where I think the stakes of this discussion truly live. And I'll use myself as an example. I've played and enjoyed many open world RPGs, but I've beaten shockingly few of them. What happens is this: I engage with the game as an open world. I explore everything. I chase side quests. I do optional activities. I inhabit the world. 100 hours later, I've barely touched the main story, and I'm done. I lie to myself. I don't tell myself I quit, but I did. And years later, I'll pick the game back up, start a brand new file, and repeat that same process all over again. There's actually a name for this in psychology: decision fatigue. The more choices you're given, the harder it becomes to make any one choice feel meaningful, and the more likely you are to disengage entirely. When nearly every quest is optional, none of them feel essential. When every direction is open, none of them feel urgent. Is this partly a me problem? Absolutely. But human psychology tends to cluster. If I experience this, others certainly do too. And I don't have this problem with linear games because linear games soften that burden of decision fatigue. They don't just pace the story, they pace your attention. They decide when tension rises, when it falls, when you explore, and when you reflect. And I think there's something deeply comforting about that. Not restrictive. Comforting, like being guided through a great novel instead of being dropped into a huge library and being told to make something out of it. There's just something deeply satisfying about finishing a game, about closure, about resolution, about knowing you saw the story through. And there's something subtly frustrating about reflecting on a game you loved but never completed, a narrative left hanging, a journey unfinished. If linear games optimize against that feeling, and I think they generally do, isn't that a meaningful point in their favor? Now I can already hear the counter argument. So what's the problem, Nick? A well-designed open world gives the player choice. If you want tight pacing, just focus on the main story. If you want to wander, wander. How is having that option not strictly better than lacking it? And I would say that's a great question. Again, I'm not here to argue open worlds aren't a valid design philosophy. They clearly are. Their popularity and mainstream success speaks for itself. But I'd maintain that truly tight pacing requires directorial control. And that control is fundamentally harder to achieve when players are given unrestricted freedom. And this is where I think the trade-off becomes real. Open world design optimizes for freedom and exploration, while linear design optimizes for momentum, coherence, and completion. With that psychological foundation in place, we will look at some concrete examples to sharpen the point. But first, let me introduce myself really quickly. This is Nick BRPG. If you like RPG talk, video essays, and systems and design analysis, welcome home. Consider giving me a like and a sub. I'm a new creator, and your support helps me out a lot. The first example I would like to call on is Clair Obscur, Expedition 33. And before anyone accuses me of adding to the quote-unquote Expedition 33 glaze, just appreciate that regardless of what you or I think, this is the most awarded game in award show history. It's critically acclaimed, and a lot of people, myself included, really enjoyed this game. And there are many reasons for that, most of which I discussed in a previous video essay linked like here. But one element I actually missed in that essay is just how expertly paced Expedition 33 really is. And while a lot of that comes from its outstanding script and cinematic direction, one of the game's most important pacing tools is, you guessed it, its linearity. Expedition 33 is a linear game that goes to extraordinary lengths not to feel linear. And I think that illusion, that careful, deliberate design, is a huge part of its magic. Right from the very prologue, which is extremely on rails, let's not mince words, you're still given a surprising amount to do in that hallway. There are collectibles, engaging conversations, snappy side quests, and even an optional fight right off the main path. One of the key ways Expedition 33 succeeds is through sheer content density. Whether it's encounters, visual flourishes, or character moments, there's always something new stimulating you, distracting you from the fact that in most zones, bar the occasional offshoot, you're walking forward. One of my favorite examples is the Stonewave Cliffs. You move through what is technically a straight path for most of the zone, but in the span of 10 minutes you'll get environmental storytelling, character moments, new enemy types, and a mechanical wrinkle, all before your brain ever has time to register that you're being guided. You're already emotionally invested in the next beat, and that's not accidental. That's pacing by design. And I should add that I think this kind of masking is very smart design. Even though I'm defending linear structure as a valid philosophy, I'm not saying players should consciously feel like they're on rails or playing a quote-unquote hallway simulator. By creating the illusion of openness through sweeping vistas, limited side paths, and the absence of a map, Expedition 33 cleverly masks its linearity. And I'm confident that was a deliberate design choice on the part of Sandfall Interactive. You are in control. You are exploring at your pace, but the scenario is tight and the game is always guiding you towards the next major story beat, the next emotional moment, the next big fight. Now I can already hear one objection, but Nick, Expedition 33 has a ton of side content. How can you possibly call it a linear game? To which I'd say, side content doesn't necessarily make a game open world by design. For starters, most of Expedition 33's side content is post-game content. You can do it before finishing the story, but that's not the design intent. And even when you do engage with it, the content is generally easy to find, easy to access, and easy to complete, with some exceptions. And with few exceptions, they don't open massive new play spaces or dramatically alter the core flow of the game. In other words, the content is discovered linearly and engaged with linearly. And that's not a design flaw. That's the point. And I should also add that linearity is, like most things, a spectrum. A sliding scale that on one end affords a player virtually no lateral movement or side content. Final Fantasy XIII is often, I think rightly, accused of being far on this side of the spectrum, while the opposite side is essentially full freedom. The Elder Scrolls titles, or say Zelda Breath of the Wild, pretty well encompass something closer to that side of the spectrum. Expedition 33, I would argue, is in the linear half of that spectrum, but I'm not arguing it's as linear as a game could possibly be. I can already hear another objection too. But wait, Nick, if linear design only works when developers carefully mask it, isn't that in itself proof that linear design is bad? You wouldn't need to disguise good game design, would you? And that's a strong argument, but this brings us back to my core thesis about trade-offs. Every design system has trade-offs. If graphics are too advanced, fewer people can run the game. If mechanics are too simple, they're boring. If they're too complex, they're alienating. Linearity does risk making players feel constrained, but it grants developers directorial control over the narrative flow and pacing. Open world design grants massive freedom, but it risks destroying pacing altogether. In open world games, players can get lost in the world, lose narrative momentum, burn out on side content, or simply quit after dozens of hours without making meaningful progress in the main story. The proverbial case of side quest fatigue. I'd argue those are the structural risks of open world design. For example, remember how earlier in this video I talked about Expedition 33's content density? I think that's a trade-off open world games almost inevitably sacrifice. It is much harder to tightly pack compelling content across much larger maps. This is arguably the hill Starfield died on. I never played it myself, but I remember the buzz. Quote-unquote, a mile wide and an inch deep became the defining phrase surrounding it. It's the opposite of a hallway simulator. It's something like a sterile plane simulator. So let's flip the script on that previous question and ask, if open world games risk being big but shallow, fatiguing players before they can reach narrative payoffs, doesn't that suggest linear design might be better? And my honest answer is, I don't know. These are the choices and trade-offs that developers face. This video is not me arguing that linear games are better than open world games. If you force me to answer personally, I will say I prefer linear games. I just tend to burn out on massive open worlds before finishing them. But I realize that that's just my experience and my opinion, and I genuinely respect the strengths and weaknesses of both philosophies. Now I want to call on a beloved classic as my second case study. Like most games of the mid-90s, Chrono Trigger is not a game of massive scale or scope, but unlike most of its contemporaries, it's widely regarded as an untouchable masterpiece, a timeless classic that, more than 30 years later, doesn't just hold up, but often outshines modern RPGs in terms of its elegance and design discipline. Strong words? And I personally endorse them fully. Chrono Trigger is lauded for many reasons, but one of the most frequently cited is its incredible pacing. And yes, it's also a very linear game structurally. Once again, like Expedition 33, it masks that linearity through constant stimulation. Major story beats are never far apart, wildly different locations, tonal shifts, and mechanical ideas arrive rapidly, with optional or fun content sprinkled in between, though most of that side content appears in the late game. But even with all of the content, side or otherwise, Chrono Trigger is roughly a 20-hour experience. It's not oversized, it's not bloated. Now, one might argue, sure, but most games were linear in the 90s. That wasn't a deliberate design philosophy, it was just a technical limitation. And that just might be true. Maybe if Chrono Trigger were made in the 2020s, it too would be bloated with side content and minigames to the detriment of its pacing. I could buy that. But if we take that argument seriously, that linearity and limitations of its time alone explains Chrono Trigger's brilliance, then we should expect most RPGs of that era to feel just as good. And history clearly doesn't bear that out. Chrono Trigger isn't remembered because it was just good for its time. It's remembered because it's timeless. Because its design holds up better than most modern games, despite having 3 decades less technological and theoretical development behind it. Could it have achieved its legendary pacing without being as linear as it is? Really? I don't think so. One of the reasons Chrono Trigger ages so well isn't just nostalgia, it's restraint. The game almost never wastes your time. There are no bloated systems, no filler arcs, no mechanical cul-de-sacs that exist solely to pad runtime. Every hour feels intentional. And I think that's something that modern games struggle with. Not because developers lack talent, but because the scale of modern games itself introduces pressure to fill space. When the world is massive, developers feel compelled to justify its size, and that's where pacing often goes to die. Now I want to preempt one other argument from Chrono Trigger diehards. Bold of you to assume I'm not one of you. Hold on, Nick. Chrono Trigger has 15 different endings. You're going to call that linear design? And my answer is yes. Don't confuse player choice with non-linearity. Open world games often do have more choice, think Skyrim or The Witcher 3, but these are still fundamentally different variables. Yes, Chrono Trigger lets you challenge the final boss early if you want to. Yes, beating the game at different moments triggers different endings. That was unprecedented for its time and still incredibly cool, but it doesn't make the game open world. It's a linear world with branching outcomes. And don't worry, if you want a deeper dive analysis a lot like this on player choice, I already have plans to make a video about that in the future, so stay tuned. But for now, just understand that while open world and player choice very often overlap, they are not the same thing, and they should not be conflated. So far, I've used two beloved games to show how relative linearity can enhance pacing. But what if I turn up the heat a little and talk about a game where openness actively held it back? Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, a game that I think is overall very good, let me be clear, is part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. The original Final Fantasy VII, like most RPGs of its era, was fairly linear. Yes, it had optional content, quite a bit for its time, but nothing close to modern standards of scale. But let me show you something. These are Steam reviews. Not handpicked, not cherry-picked, just what comes up immediately on the store page at the time of recording this video. I'll read some highlights. Open world is filled with the same 5 interest points over and over. Ubisoft Tower, Livestream, random annoying minigame, slow walk towards Chocobo. Beside the extreme padding and bad pacing, the story is okay. Another one goes, screw the Kate Sith minigame, please do not do this kinda again. And yet another, if they took all the bloated minigames out, this would be so good. The amount of slog you have to go through is insane. And we'll just look at one more. Cool game, but extremely long. This has more filler than Naruto Shippuden. Okay, that one made me laugh. Those of you who know. And here's the thing, I could nitpick some of these critiques at the margins, but the truth is, I broadly agree with the emotional thrust behind them. And I think a lot of fans do too. I'd absolutely recommend Rebirth. I do think its strengths outweigh its flaws. But to me, Rebirth ended up being a near masterpiece reduced to a merely good game because of how overstuffed it was. What makes this especially frustrating is that Rebirth isn't bloated because it lacks talent. It's bloated because it's trying to be generous. It wants to give players more content, more freedom, more things to do. But generosity without restraint can become indulgence. And indulgence in narrative design almost always comes at the cost of momentum. If much of that bloat were trimmed, if the pacing were tighter, I generally believe Rebirth could have reached much greater heights. And while some of this is admittedly, quote, trust me, bro, I've talked to a lot of players about this, lurked in plenty of discussion threads, and the pulse is very clear. Great game, too long, too bloated, pacing issues. I have a mantra that I've used before on this channel. Bad content is worse than no content. And I believe that to be true even of optional content. This is one reason why I so often find myself arguing in favor of shorter games. I fundamentally believe that 30 or 40 near perfect hours are better than 80 on balance good hours that have drastic spikes and troughs in quality along the way. And the argument, just skip side content if you don't like it, just seriously does not hold water. Just because I might hate the minigame doesn't mean I hate the powerful upgrade, the hidden character, the cutscene, or the story beat that is so often gated behind said minigame. Going back to human psychology for a second, this creates tension. If the best weapon, or worse still, the true ending of the game is gated behind optional content and minigames, the friction is there. Now, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not arguing that linear games necessarily have good pacing. Plenty of linear games are horribly paced, whether due to sluggish mechanics, punishing random encounter rates, or opaque dungeon design that leaves players lost and frustrated. And I'm not saying open world games necessarily have bad pacing. They can be paced well, although I will say that when open world games do have good pacing, it's usually because players choose to engage with them more linearly by focusing on the main story and skipping large portions of optional content. But the existence of that option does not eliminate the trade-off, it just shifts the burden onto the player instead of the designer. Linear games bake pacing into the structure of the game itself. Open world games outsource pacing to player behavior. I'm not saying it's inherently bad, but it is meaningfully different. So to wrap this video up, I think linear game design works, especially for games that want to prioritize pacing and narrative momentum. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 and Chrono Trigger are two fantastic examples, modern and classic, that demonstrate how powerful structured linearity can be. Well, that's all I've got for today's video essay. If this video essay even nudged you slightly from reflexively thinking open world good, linear bad, and toward a more nuanced understanding that both philosophies have their strengths, weaknesses, and trade-offs, then I'd consider that a win. Let me know in the comments if this video shifted your thinking at all, or if you already agreed with me before, or if you disagree with the argument entirely. Either way, this is Nick BRPG. The RPG discourse will continue. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.